Lyris moved through the emerald gloom of the forest like a blade of shadow. Every step was measured, every breath regulated. For 3 planetary rotations, this place had been her hunting ground, and now it felt less like an alien wilderness and more like an extension of her own predatory mind. The forest floor was a damp cushion, swallowing even the smallest sound. Her boots, armored and matte black, sank into the mulch without leaving more than a suggestion of a track. Her mission had been precise: locate and capture the human survivor, subject designation Kalen, the lone remnant of a long-forgotten colonist transport. High Command had spoken in their cold, clinical tone, as if he were nothing more than data to be retrieved, a biological puzzle piece to solve the slow death of her people. The Zyrian homeworld was failing, crops withering, birth rates plummeting, extinction looming on the edge of every council report. And somehow, this man's existence was the key. The mission dossier had described him as feral. Dangerous. A creature shaped by isolation, a living algorithm of survival. Lyris had prepared herself for a wild hunt, for the snapping jaws of a cornered predator. She had honed her senses across a dozen worlds, her pointed ears swiveling independently to map the forest in real time. Now, as she crouched beneath a curtain of vine-choked ferns, the air was thick with more than humidity. Smoke. Not the acrid reek of a wildfire, but a thin, intermittent thread of wood smoke, laced with the sharp, savory scent of cooking food. Her nostrils flared. No feral animal risked a fire in hostile territory. He was either careless or supremely confident. Neither possibility fit the mission profile, and both sent an electric thrill down her spine. She unslung her pulse rifle, the weapon humming softly as it charged, and advanced. Each step was silent now, her body sinking deeper into the hunter's trance. She found the trail signs soon after. An angled scuff on a rock, a broken branch laid deliberately across the path. It was almost insulting in its clarity. A trap, she thought, baring her teeth. He was trying to lure her in. Good. Circling wide, she bypassed the obvious route, pushing through a tangle of thorned vines that left faint scratches on her armor. The smell of smoke grew stronger, mixing with the resinous scent of the massive Virian trees around her. She reached a rocky ledge, crouched, and peered through the fern fronds. And froze. He was there. Kalen. Not crouched behind a barricade, not sharpening a spear, not even holding a weapon. He was seated by a crackling fire, his back against a boulder, calmly stirring something in a battered iron pot suspended above the flames. His bare arms, corded with muscle, moved with slow, practiced ease. His chest, crossed by a simple leather harness, glistened faintly with sweat in the warm air. He was not hiding. He was waiting. The sight locked every one of Lyris's instincts into stunned stillness. This was not a cornered animal. This was a man who belonged here. The tactical part of her mind screamed that this was impossible. He had no visible energy weapon. His only tool was the knife at his hip. One shot, just one, and she could complete her mission before he even stood up. Her finger rested on the trigger. And then he looked up. Their eyes met across 20 meters of dense foliage. There was no surprise on his face, no sudden stiffening of muscle. He simply regarded her with a calm, steady gaze, as though he had been expecting her all along. "You can come down now," Kalen said. His voice was deep, carrying easily through the still air. It was not a command, not even a challenge. It was an invitation. "Food's almost ready. I imagine you're hungry." Lyris stayed frozen a heartbeat longer, her tactical mind a storm of contradiction. This had to be a trap. Yet there were no hidden power signatures, no movement in the underbrush, no sound of waiting soldiers. Only the man, the fire, and the offer. Slowly, she rose from her crouch. Her boots crunched softly on the gravel as she descended the slope, rifle still leveled at his chest. Kalen didn't move. Didn't even reach for his knife. He just watched her, his dark eyes following every step with unsettling patience. She stopped 5 meters from the fire, her stance wide, ready to dive or shoot in a breath's time. "Smells good," he said mildly, glancing back at the pot. "Local root vegetable. A little bland unless you add the right herbs. Found some east of here." The casual tone hit her like a physical blow. She was armed, armored, and seconds from taking him down, and he was talking about cooking. "Why aren't you running?" she demanded, her voice low, dangerous. "From what?" Kalen asked. His lips curved into the faintest smile. "A guest for dinner." "I am not your guest," she snapped. "I am your hunter." That earned her a longer look, his expression warming in a way that made her stomach tighten. "You've been stalking me for 3 days," he said. "If you really wanted me dead or in chains, you've had plenty of chances. But you're here. Not up there, with a rifle scope on me." He set the pot aside, producing 2 bowls and placing one halfway between them. Steam curled up, carrying a rich, earthy aroma that made her stomach tighten with sudden, unwanted hunger. Curiosity battled with protocol inside her. This was a violation of every mission rule she had ever been given. Capture. Contain. Do not engage. And yet, she lowered her rifle. The weapon slung across her back felt strangely heavy as she crossed the last meters and sank into a crouch opposite him. She stayed tense, ready to spring. He filled her bowl first, the gesture strangely formal, almost ceremonial. Lyris picked it up.
The first spoonful sent an explosion of flavor across her tongue, peppery heat, savory herbs, a depth she hadn't tasted in months aboard the sterile warship. Against her will, some of the iron tension in her shoulders bled away. Kalen watched her, not gloating, just waiting. "So," he said finally, "what does the Zyrian High Command want with the descendant of a ship they claim was destroyed?" Her spoon stopped halfway to her lips. He knew. He knew who she was. He knew why she was here. The forest around her felt suddenly less like cover and more like a net. This wasn't a hunt. It was an invitation, and she had just accepted. The silence after his question stretched, heavy as a storm front. Lyris placed the bowl down with deliberate care, though her pulse had kicked into a punishing rhythm. This was no ordinary prey. He hadn't just known she was nearby, he had known who she was, what ship had brought her, even what orders she carried. Kalen didn't press. He simply stood, stretching with an easy grace, and walked to the stone wall at the back of the camp. When he laid his palm against the mossy surface, Lyris expected nothing. But the rock hummed beneath her boots, and a seam of pale light split the stone. The wall opened. Massive doors of perfect geometry swung inward without a sound, revealing a cavern glowing with a soft artificial light. Her hand drifted toward her rifle, but she didn't raise it. There was no trap, no ambush, only the sudden vertigo of her entire mission unraveling. "The test is over, Lyris," Kalen said, turning back toward her. The light behind him carved him into something mythic, the rough edges of his beard and the leather strap across his chest catching the glow. "Your people think our strength is in our blood. They're wrong. It's here. Come and see." Every instinct told her to stay on the outside. Instead, she followed him through the opening. The interior stole her breath. This wasn't a cave. It was a world unto itself. Great walkways spanned a central shaft plunging deep into the mountain, lined with pipes, conduits, and platforms. Hydroponic gardens climbed the walls like glowing terraces, feeding the air with the sharp, green scent of growing things. Sections of metal hull had been fused into the rock, remnants of a crashed colony ship painstakingly converted into a home. And there were people. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all dressed in practical, earth-toned clothing. They paused to look up at her with quiet, level gazes. There was no fear in their eyes. They had expected her. Kaelin led her along a narrow catwalk, speaking as they walked. This is the hearth. 10 generations ago, when our ship came down, we were cut off. No rescue. No resupply. Everything you see here was built from the wreckage and from the mountain itself. We didn't just survive, we learned to live with this world instead of conquering it. His words sank into her like slow-moving fire. The Zyrian world was crumbling, soil poisoned, air thick with toxins. And here was a people who had turned catastrophe into renewal. Why show me this? She asked, her voice rough. Why not remain hidden? Because your ship didn't come alone, Kaelin said, his expression sobering. Your planet is screaming its death throes into the void. We heard it. We knew you would come looking for answers. His steps slowed as they reached a viewing platform. Below, more levels stretched downward, humming with energy, a small city carved into the heart of the mountain. But we had to know who they'd send, he continued. A conqueror or something else. That's what the last 3 days have been, Lyris. Not a hunt. An interview. The words landed like a pulse blast. Her mission parameters seemed suddenly childish. Capture, dissect, reverse engineer. As though this place could ever be reduced to a sample vial. Before she could answer, a deep klaxon blared through the chamber. Red lights snapped on, pulsing in time with the alarm. Kaelin's calm expression hardened into focus. He tapped a device on his wrist, projecting a hovering schematic. One ship entering atmosphere, he said grimly. Military signature. Not cloaked. They want us to see them. Lyris felt the blood drain from her face. Varen, she muttered. Her commander. Of course he had lost patience. Varen believed diplomacy was a waste of air. If she had not reported back with the target by now, he would do what he always did, force the issue with troops and firepower. They're landing 2 clicks away, Kaelin continued, already moving. Ground teams in minutes. We need to move. He didn't ask for her consent. He simply caught her by the arm and pulled her toward a service ladder. The contact burned through the fabric of her undersuit, an uninvited spark in the middle of rising chaos. The hearth came alive around them. Alarms echoed, voices shouted orders, heavy blast doors slid into place with metallic finality. Kaelin led her down into the guts of the mountain, where narrow maintenance corridors twisted through a maze of conduits and cables. They'll sweep the main levels first, he said, dropping into a low crawl space barely wide enough for 2 people. This way, quiet. He killed the light on his wrist device, plunging them into absolute black. Lyris pressed against the wall, every nerve screaming. Kaelin was right behind her, his solid bulk a wall of heat in the tight space. She could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. Feel it against her back. Then came the sound of boots. Her pointed ears swiveled, locking on the heavy synchronized thud of Zyrian soldiers in the corridor beyond. Varen's troops. Her former comrades. They were hunting her now, as surely as she had hunted Kaelin. She held her breath. Kaelin's hand settled on the small of her back. Not a caress. Just a grounding pressure. A silent message, stay still. Outside, the boots passed. The patrol faded into silence, leaving only their breathing in the dark. Kaelin waited another long moment before moving past her, his shoulder brushing hers in the narrow space. Follow me, he murmured. Lyris obeyed. Together they slipped deeper into the mountain, into unrecorded levels that had never appeared on her mission schematics. Whatever came next, she was no longer merely a hunter, or a soldier. She was a fugitive, a reluctant ally, and, though she barely dared to admit it, a woman beginning to trust the man who had just turned her world inside out. The tunnels seemed endless, twisting deeper into the mountain's heart. Lyris kept close on Kalen's heels, her senses straining for the slightest sign of pursuit. The air down here was warmer, tinged with the mineral tang of geothermal vents. Pipes lined the walls like veins, carrying heat and power through the hearth's underbelly. At last they emerged into a small junction chamber. A single bulb overhead cast a dim yellow pool of light. Kalen leaned against the wall, his broad chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. For the first time since the alarm, she saw the edge of fatigue in his posture. "Your commander doesn't waste time," he said. "Varen never negotiates," Lyris replied bitterly. "He believes force is the only language the galaxy understands." Kalen studied her for a moment, his eyes dark and steady. "And what do you believe?" The question landed like a shot. Lyris stared at him, hearing again the quiet domestic crackle of the fire, smelling the stew, remembering the calm patience with which he had waited for her. She thought of the people she had seen moving through the hearth, alive, thriving, unafraid. "I believe there's another way," she said finally. Her voice felt like it belonged to someone else. A slow smile touched Kalen's lips, not triumphant but grimly pleased. "Good. Because I'm going to need your help. My people can defend our home, but we are not soldiers. You are." It was more than a request. It was an invitation, like the first one by the fire, but this time, she didn't hesitate. "Then we fight together," she said. What followed was a blur of motion and planning, yet every moment felt sharp with purpose. Kalen guided her through storage bays, forgotten workshops, and half-collapsed tunnels. He showed her choke points, control valves, and dormant machinery that could be repurposed. She provided the tactics, ambush patterns, fallback routes, ways to incapacitate rather than kill. They worked side by side, their partnership wordless at times but seamless. In one corridor, Kalen demonstrated how to overload a geothermal pressure valve to release a blinding burst of steam. In another, Lyris pointed out the perfect spot to rig a trap that would drop a net over a patrol. He improvised tools from scavenged equipment, she adjusted them with soldier's precision. By the time the first squad entered the lower levels, the hearth was ready. The ambush came without warning. A hiss of superheated steam exploded from a ruptured pipe, filling the narrow passage with a dense white cloud that blinded the Zyrian soldiers and scrambled their thermal optics. Lyris moved like a wraith, her rifle reversed as she struck with its stock, targeting nerve clusters and joints. 3 soldiers went down without a sound. Kalen handled the last 2, his sheer size a weapon in itself. He dropped a cargo net from the ceiling, entangling them before they could recover. When the fight ended, 5 soldiers lay unconscious, their weapons stripped away. As Kalen secured their bonds, a stray lock of Lyris's magenta hair slipped across her cheek. Before she could brush it back, Kalen reached out and tucked it behind her pointed ear. The touch was brief, but it felt like an electric pulse running straight to her core. She caught her breath, her amber eyes meeting his. The heat there had nothing to do with battle readiness. They moved quickly after that, setting more traps, sealing tunnels, forcing Varen's troops into predictable patterns. Each small victory drove the invaders deeper into frustration, and Lyris could practically feel her former commander's temper rising. "He'll come himself soon," she said as they stood on a high catwalk overlooking the main geothermal exchange chamber. The roar of the machinery below filled the air with a steady thunder. "He won't tolerate this much longer. His pride won't let him." Kalen nodded, his large hands gripping the railing. "Then we make our stand here." The chamber was perfect, a massive, multi-leveled space filled with pipes, venting steam, and catwalks. They positioned charges not to kill but to collapse entrances, herded patrols into dead ends, and set up choke points that would funnel Varen straight to them. When at last the commander appeared, he was exactly as Lyris had imagined. Tall, imperious, gleaming in silver-inlaid armor, flanked by his two most loyal guards. His voice boomed through the cavern, magnified by his helmet. "Lyris," he thundered. "End this. Deliver the human and the technology, and I may grant you an honorable death." Lyris stepped into the open, rifle aimed not at him but at the ceiling supports. Her voice was calm, steady. "Your idea of honor is a disease, Varen." Kalen stood beside a massive valve wheel, his hand resting on it like a coiled promise. "You think this savage is your salvation?" Varen snarled, his visor locking on Kalen. "He is a relic. His kind builds with mud. We build empires." "You build cages," Kalen replied, his deep voice cutting through the industrial roar. "And you won't build one here." Varen roared, charging forward. That was the signal. Lyris fired, her blast searing through the ceiling anchors. At the same moment, Kalen threw his weight into the valve, releasing a torrent of coolant across the floor. Steam billowed, and the ground turned slick under Varen's boots. Rocks and debris cascaded down, sealing the entrance behind him. He was trapped. Then the fight began. Varen's rifle spat plasma, the bolts hissing past as Lyris took cover, laying down suppressive fire to pin the guards. Kalen met the commander head-on, a clash of muscle and metal. He used the terrain ruthlessly, forcing Varen against pipes and valve assemblies, disarming him piece by piece. At last, the commander drew his combat blade. Kalen met him with his belt knife. The two men circled each other, steel ringing on steel. It was a brutal, intimate duel, strength against training, raw will against rigid doctrine. When Kalen finally slammed Varen against the wall, holding the knife to his throat, silence fell. The guards froze, then lowered their weapons. The fight was over. Lyris approached, rifle steady, her breath coming hard. For a long moment, she and Kalen simply stared at each other across the steaming chamber. His chest heaved with exertion, a bruise darkening along his jaw. But in his eyes burned not just victory, something else. Something that made her stomach twist and her heart beat faster. The battle had been won. The war for her loyalty had been decided too. The chamber was eerily quiet now, save for the hiss of cooling pipes and the faint drip of condensation. Varen slumped against the wall, his breath rasping inside his helmet, the edge of Kalen's knife still close enough to remind him that this fight was finished. His guards, disarmed and bound, stood in grim silence. Lyris kept her rifle trained until Kalen finally stepped back. Slowly, deliberately, she secured Varen's weapons and stripped him of his command insignia. It was an act as symbolic as it was practical. The fall of a commander, the death of his authority. "You've lost," she said, her voice steady as bedrock. Varen's lip curled, his pride unbroken even in defeat. "You think this changes anything? High Command will send more ships. They will burn this mountain to ash." "Not if I tell them what I've seen," Lyris replied. She shouldered her rifle and stood tall, meeting his glare. "I was sent here to secure a resource. Instead, I found a future worth choosing. If the High Command wants survival, they'll have to accept an alliance instead of a conquest." Varen spat on the floor, a final act of contempt, but he did not speak again. Kalen's security teams arrived, escorting the prisoners away. When the chamber was empty, the exhaustion hit her like a wave. She leaned against the railing, staring down at the twisting pipes below. Kalen moved to stand beside her, his presence as solid and grounding as the mountain itself. "You didn't have to choose this," he said quietly. "Yes," she murmured. "I did." For a long moment, they simply stood there, the tension that had strung them both so tight finally loosening. He turned toward her, one hand lifting almost without thought to brush a streak of grime from her cheek. The touch was gentle, his calloused thumb warm against her skin. Her breath caught. Kaelin. Whatever she meant to say vanished as he closed the space between them. The kiss was not cautious or questioning, it was a collision, fierce and hungry, an answer to everything that had burned unspoken between them since the forest. Her hands came up to grip his shoulders, the cold of her gauntlets a shocking contrast to the heat of his skin. When they finally broke apart, the battle roar of the geothermal vents seemed distant, muted. Tomorrow, Kaelin said softly, we'll have to face your council, your ships, your whole civilization. But right now, she finished for him, we breathe. 5 years later, the hearth was no longer a secret. Lyris stood on a balcony carved from the mountain face, her magenta hair now longer, braided loosely over one shoulder, her ears relaxed. Below her stretched a valley transformed, no longer wild and hidden, but alive with sweeping structures of metal and glass that blended into the landscape. The city of Oak Haven, as Kaelin had named it, glowed in the twin sun's light, a testament to what two peoples could build together. Her armor was long since retired, displayed in the city's archive as a relic of a time when survival was measured in hunts and battles. She wore a simple indigo tunic now, the fabric grown from a native plant cultivated by Kaelin's people. She heard him before she saw him, his steady tread across the stone. Kaelin came to stand beside her, still broad-shouldered, still radiating quiet strength, though now there were threads of silver at his temples. His presence was no longer a surprise but a constant, a center of gravity in her life. The Western farms reported record yield this season, he said, resting a warm hand on the small of her back. And the last atmospheric purifiers were delivered to the outer settlements, she replied. They'll breathe clean air before the next rotation. He smiled, that same slow, grounding smile that had first undone her years ago. Not bad for a pair of fugitives, he said. She laughed softly and turned toward him, looping her arms around his neck. Not bad at all. When he kissed her this time, it was not desperate or fierce but deep and certain, carrying with it years of shared work, of arguments and reconciliations, of nights spent planning the future. Inside, their home was simple but warm. Wooden furniture stood alongside Zyrian data consoles, tapestries telling the history of the hearth's survival hung on the walls. On the table waited a black pot, simmering slowly, filling the room with the same earthy scent that had first pulled her from the shadows all those years ago. Kaelin pulled out a chair for her. She sat, smiling faintly as he filled 2 bowls. It was more than a meal. It was a reminder, their first invitation, the choice she had made, the fire she had stepped toward instead of away from. In the next room, a small voice called for them, their daughter's bright chatter filling the air. Lyris felt a rush of fierce pride. She would grow up never knowing a dying world, never having to choose between duty and survival. She would build instead of hunt. Lyris reached across the table, taking Kaelin's hand. The warmth of his grip anchored her to the present, to the life they had built together from the ashes of war. Outside, the suns dipped lower, painting the sky in gold and violet. Inside, there was only firelight, the taste of stew, and the promise of another dawn.